In 1943, the Allies were in a tough spot during World War II. The Axis powers, led by Germany, controlled a big part of Europe. The Allies, including countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, knew that to win the war, they needed to break through German defenses in France. This idea was called Operation Overlord, and the upcoming invasion would be known as the Battle of Normandy, or, more famously, D-Day. At the center of this massive plan were some key people. General Dwight D. Eisenhower from the United States was the supreme commander of the Allied forces. He was in charge of pulling everything together and making some really tough decisions. Then there was General Bernard Montgomery from the United Kingdom, who played a big role in planning the land invasion. On the German side, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known for his clever strategies, was in charge of defending the coast of France. So, what exactly was the plan? The Allies aimed to land on 5 beaches in Normandy, a region in northern France. These beaches had code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The idea was to surprise the German forces, push them back, and start liberating Western Europe. In order to do this, the Allies needed a massive amount of coordination. To begin, paratroopers were set to jump from planes behind enemy lines the night before the beach landings. Their job was to capture key bridges and roads. This would make it harder for Germans to move reinforcements to the beaches. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the Allied forces would arrive by boat to storm the beaches themselves. Over 156,000 troops were involved that day, making it the largest seaborne invasion in history. Setting up the attack wasn't easy. They needed to gather masses of ships, planes, and tanks. Imagine standing on a beach looking at over 5,000 ships and 14,000 aircraft. The Allies also had to figure out how to supply all these troops, including things like fuel, food, and ammunition. They used ingenious technology, creating floating harbors and underwater pipelines to transport supplies from ships to the shore. There were big challenges along the way. The weather was a constant headache. For an invasion this big, they needed calm seas and clear skies. Just days before the attack, a huge storm hit. Eisenhower had to decide whether to delay the attack, which could throw the entire plan into chaos. In the end, he took a calculated risk and gave the go-ahead. There was also the issue of keeping the whole operation secret from Germany. To fool the Germans, the Allies staged fake operations, leading the enemy to believe the invasion would happen somewhere else. The results of D-Day were significant. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. But the fighting was tough and many lives were lost. However, this was the turning point. Over the next weeks and months, more troops arrived, and the Allies pushed the German forces back, eventually leading to the liberation of Paris and, later, the rest of Western Europe. Today, the Normandy campaign matters because it marked the beginning of the end for World War II in Europe. It showed the power of international cooperation and strategic planning. Understanding the planning, risks, and execution of the Normandy campaign helps us appreciate the efforts and sacrifices made to secure the freedoms many enjoy today. By early 1944, things were looking tense on Europe's Western Front. The Allies, which included countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, knew they needed a big move to turn the tide in World War II against Nazi Germany. After long planning, all efforts were focused on a huge invasion, something that had never been done before. This led to D-Day, an operation known as Operation Overlord. This all kicked off on June 6, 1944. The idea was to land on the beaches of Normandy, a region in northern France. It was key because the Allies wanted to set up a stronghold in Europe from which they could advance, bringing the fight directly to the Nazis. Key figures were involved in this operation: General Dwight D. Eisenhower from the United States was in charge of the whole thing. He had to coordinate troops from various countries. British General Bernard Montgomery was another important leader, planning the ground assault. These guys, along with other leaders, had the challenge of getting literally thousands of soldiers, vehicles, and tons of supplies across the English Channel under dangerous conditions. On D-Day, everything started with aerial and naval bombardments at dawn. Thousands of planes dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines to disrupt the German defenses. Then, around 156,000 troops from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other Allied nations stormed the beaches of Normandy. They landed on 5 different beaches with code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Now the technical side might sound a bit like a huge puzzle. To land the soldiers and equipment, the Allies used special ships called landing craft. These ships could get super close to the shore so that troops and tanks could roll off directly onto the beach. The troops faced strong defenses, including machine gun nests, mines, and huge barriers the Germans had set up. However, the day did not go as smoothly as hoped. The weather was bad with rough seas and clouds, making things really hard. At Omaha Beach, for instance, the American troops faced fierce resistance and suffered heavy casualties. There were hundreds of problems to go through, from navigation errors to communications breakdowns and heavy German fire. Despite these challenges, the invasion was a success. By the end of the day, the Allies had a foothold on all 5 beaches. This meant more troops and supplies could follow in the days to come, expanding the area under Allied control. So, why should this matter to us today? Well, D-Day was a major turning point in World War II. It pushed the Nazis back and led to the liberation of Western Europe from German control. The success at Normandy gave hope to people around the world and contributed to the eventual end of the war in 1945. Remembering D-Day helps us appreciate the courage and teamwork needed to overcome incredible odds, reminding us of what people can achieve when they work together towards a common goal. In the early 1940s, during World War II, things were looking rough for the Allies. The Axis powers were strong, and Adolf Hitler's German army had taken over big parts of Europe. The Allies needed a big move to turn the tables, so they planned something huge called Operation Overlord. This was all about landing a massive army in Normandy, a region in northern France, and pushing the Germans back. On June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, more than 156,000 soldiers from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other Allied countries landed on the beaches of Normandy. The main players were General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Commander, and key military leaders like General Bernard Montgomery from the United Kingdom and General Omar Bradley from the United States. These leaders coordinated this enormous operation, with thousands of ships and aircraft supporting the troops. The beachhead operation was about securing a strong position on the enemy-held coast. The troops divided into 5 different beaches with code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At the crack of dawn, soldiers stormed the beaches under heavy fire. The landings were brutal. For example, Omaha Beach saw some of the fiercest fighting, with steep cliffs and strong German defenses. The technical side of things was complex but super interesting. The Allies used special vehicles called amphibious tanks that could move from water to land. Engineers also developed floating harbors, known as mulberry harbors, to quickly bring in supplies. Landing the soldiers was a huge puzzle, combining different units and equipment from the water and the sky. Paratroopers jumped from planes in the night to drop behind enemy lines and disrupt German defenses. But securing a foothold wasn't easy. They faced tough weather, rough terrain, and fierce opposition. Many of the beaches had obstacles and mines planted by the Germans to prevent a landing. There was confusion and chaos, especially on Omaha Beach, where the soldiers struggled to get past the defenses. Communication was a challenge because coordinating thousands of troops in real time was no small feat. The soldiers had to stay focused under extreme pressure. Despite these problems, by the end of the day, the Allies had a firm foothold in Normandy. It wasn't perfect, and it took more time to fully secure the beaches and push inland. But this was a turning point. Over the following weeks, the Allies brought in reinforcements and supplies through their newly secured beachhead. They eventually broke through German lines and started the push towards liberating Europe from Nazi control. Why should we care about this today? The Normandy campaign marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's regime. It showed the power of teamwork and planning. The bravery and sacrifice of those soldiers made a huge difference, ensuring freedom and peace for future generations. Plus, the strategies developed during this campaign have shaped how military operations are conducted even today. In simple terms, the success of the Normandy campaign showed that even when things look bleak, smart planning, courage, and cooperation can open the way to victory. It was a remarkable effort that changed the course of history. In June 1944, the beaches of Normandy were buzzing with activity. It was the start of something big during World War II, as Allied forces prepared to push into France. Landing on the beaches was the first step, and now the real fight was to move inland and liberate Europe from German control. After the landings on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, the Allied forces, including troops from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and other nations, faced a new challenge. The beaches were just the beginning. The real goal was to advance through the French countryside. This meant dealing with hedgerows, thick, tall bushes and trees on mounds of dirt that turned the landscape into a maze. The key players in this push were the commanders of the Allied forces, like General Dwight D. Eisenhower from the United States and General Bernard Montgomery from the United Kingdom. They were in charge of coming up with plans and making sure everyone followed them. These leaders worked together to make sure their armies could fight through the tricky terrain and strong enemy defenses. The battle was not easy. After landing, the soldiers faced well-armed German troops who used the hedgerows to their advantage. The Germans set up defenses in and around these natural barriers, which made advancing much harder for the Allies. The Allies had to adapt. Engineers created special tanks with metal cutters to break through the hedgerows. These tanks were a big help for moving around the French countryside, but it was not just about technology. The soldiers had to be brave and smart. They attacked town after town, with fierce battles in places like Saint-Lô and Caen. Each town meant fierce fighting, but getting control of them was necessary for pushing the Germans back. Weather was a major problem. Heavy summer rain turned fields into mud and slowed down movement. Supplies had to be brought in across rough seas, which was not easy. Communication was sometimes tricky, too. Radios were not always reliable, so they had to use runners, soldiers who carried messages by hand. Despite these problems, the Allies kept pushing. By the end of July 1944, they had made significant gains. They broke out of Normandy and moved farther into France. Their ability to overcome challenges showed what teamwork and determination could do. This push inward changed the course of the war. Once the Allies were able to move past the beaches, they gained momentum. This led to the liberation of Paris in August 1944 and eventually helped defeat Nazi Germany in May 1945. Why does this matter today? It is a reminder of the importance of working together to overcome tough situations. The Normandy campaign showed that a group of nations, united with a common goal, could face and defeat a powerful enemy. This sense of unity and perseverance is something worth remembering and learning from, even now. In late July 1944, the Normandy campaign was at a crucial point. The Allies had landed on the beaches of Normandy in June and were now stuck in difficult battles with German forces. This was not the quick victory they had hoped for. Roads were clogged, and the countryside, full of thick hedgerows, made it tough to move around. The Allies needed a breakthrough if they were going to push the Germans back and take more of France. That's where Operation Cobra comes in. This was a plan by the United States First Army, led by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. The idea was simple: break through the German defenses and allow the Allies to spread out into open areas where they could use their numbers and equipment to their advantage. Lieutenant General Bradley had a big job. He worked closely with General Bernard Montgomery from the United Kingdom, who was leading the overall land battle plan in Normandy. Together, they had to figure out how to make the best use of their resources. The plan kicked off on July 25, 1944. It began with a massive bombing run. Hundreds of American planes dropped bombs on the German lines. These were heavy bombers and fighter bombers, dropping explosives to weaken German positions. This was not just about blowing stuff up. It was about creating chaos and confusion. If the Germans were disoriented, the American troops could move in and hit hard. Unfortunately, things did not go perfectly. Some bombs fell short and hit American soldiers by mistake. This was a tough moment for everyone involved, but the soldiers pressed on. Once the air attack ended, it was time for ground troops to move. Tank units, like the Sherman tanks with their 75mm guns, rolled through the gap created by the bombing. Infantry followed, ready to fight any surviving German soldiers. The key was speed. They needed to keep moving to stop the Germans from regrouping. But problems popped up. The thick hedgerows made it hard for tanks to get through. The Germans were also experienced and dug in deep. They fought fiercely to protect their positions and at times pushed the Allies back. Yet, over a few days, the Americans began to break through. By July 27th, they had widened the gap. More troops poured in, and the tide started to turn. This operation faced challenges, like communication issues and bad weather. But gradually, the German defenses started to crumble, and their forces pulled back. By the end of July, Operation Cobra had successfully broken the Normandy stalemate. The Allies could now spread into the open fields of France, which was exactly the kind of fighting they were better equipped for. The success of Operation Cobra had big impacts. It marked a turning point in the Normandy campaign. The Germans had fewer places to retreat to and began losing control in France. This helped lead to the liberation of Paris a month later, on August 25, 1944. Operation Cobra matters today because it shows how planning, persistence, and adaptation in battle can lead to success. Even when things do not go as planned, continuing to push and find new solutions can overcome obstacles. It also reminds us of the teamwork needed to achieve big goals, as the Allies showed when they worked together in tough situations. By the summer of 1944, World War II was raging, and France had been under German control for 4 long years. People were tired of living under occupation, and they wanted their freedom back. Meanwhile, the Allies, who were the countries fighting against Germany, were planning something big. They were getting ready to launch a massive attack to push the Germans out of France. This was called the Normandy Invasion, or D-Day, and it happened on June 6, 1944. In the days and weeks after D-Day, the people of France started to rise up. They were part of what's called the French Resistance. These were ordinary people like farmers, shopkeepers, and students who secretly worked against the Germans. They would gather information, help Allied soldiers, and sometimes even fight. A key player in this uprising was the Free French Forces, led by Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle had been living in London, coordinating efforts to support the resistance movement. He encouraged more French people to join the fight and help the advancing Allied forces. So, what happened during this uprising? It started with small acts of defiance. People would cut telephone lines or damage train tracks to disrupt the German operations. As the Allies moved further into France, the resistance became more daring. They would sabotage supply lines and even launch surprise attacks on German troops. One of the ways this worked, technically, was through secret communications. The resistance used radio transmissions and secret codes to share their plans. They had to be very careful because the Germans were always trying to listen in on their conversations. They even used bicycles to move around quickly and avoid detection. There were lots of problems, though. Being part of the resistance was very risky. If the Germans caught you, the consequences could be deadly. Supplies were hard to come by, and the resistance fighters often had to make do with whatever they could find. Coordination was also a big challenge because there were several resistance groups all over France, and they didn't always communicate very well. But despite these challenges, the resistance achieved some amazing things. Their actions helped slow down the German response to the Allied invasion. They also gave the Allies valuable information about where German troops and defenses were located. This kind of inside information made a big difference as the Allies pushed deeper into France. By August 1944, much of France was free, including its capital, Paris. The sight of French and Allied troops marching into Paris was a huge morale boost for everyone fighting against the Germans. The liberation of France was an important step in eventually defeating Germany and ending World War II in Europe. Today, we care about this because it's a story of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. They didn't have military training or fancy equipment, but they made a significant impact. The French resistance showed how powerful people can be when they're fighting for their homes and their freedom. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, courage and unity can lead to real change. In 1944, Europe was in the middle of World War II. The Allies needed to make a big move if they wanted to push back against Nazi Germany. This led to the planning of a huge operation to invade northern France. It was called the Normandy Campaign, or D-Day. The goal was to free France and then push the German forces back into their own country. The Allied forces were made up of soldiers from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and other countries. Some key people were General Dwight D. Eisenhower from the United States, who was in charge of the whole operation, and General Bernard Montgomery from the United Kingdom, who led the ground troops. The Germans were led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was a very skilled commander. Early in the morning of June 6, 1944, Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. There were 5 main beach landing areas given special code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Thousands of ships and aircraft supported the troops, dropping bombs and landing soldiers. Paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines to take control of important places. The troops used special tanks called amphibious tanks that could move from the sea to land. The soldiers also had to deal with obstacles the Germans had left on the beach to slow them down, like barbed wire and mines. The weather was bad, with high winds and rough seas, making a tough job even harder. One of the biggest challenges of the Normandy campaign was the strong German defenses. At Omaha Beach, for example, the United States soldiers faced heavy enemy fire and the highest number of casualties. It was a nightmare, but after tough fighting, they made it through. Another problem was organizing such a big operation that involved over 150,000 soldiers landing on the first day. By late August, the Allies had liberated Paris, and by September 1944, they had pushed the Germans out of most of France. The success of the Normandy campaign was a big turning point in the war. It helped make sure the Allies would win in Europe. It also allowed them to open a Western front against Nazi Germany, which was already fighting the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. So why should we care about Normandy today? Well, it reminds us that teamwork can bring about amazing results, even when the situation looks really tough. The operation showed the value of planning, bravery, and never giving up. It also marked the beginning of the end for one of history's most evil regimes. Today, the Normandy beaches are peaceful, but they stand as a reminder of the sacrifices people made to protect freedom and democracy. The legacy of the Normandy campaign teaches us about the costs of war, the importance of standing firm against tyranny, and how people from different countries can come together to achieve great things. It's a story of courage and cooperation that's worth remembering.